Sometimes a man's worth is measured not by what he's done, but by what he's willing to face when everything seems lost. In the dusty streets of Dustwater, where justice comes at the end of a rope, one drifter is about to prove that even the wildest things can recognize a kindred spirit. Eli Cade never meant to steal anything, especially not the devil horse, a black stallion so fierce that grown men cross themselves when it passes. But Sheriff Hawkins doesn't care about the truth. He's got a town to impress and a reputation to maintain. Instead of a quick hanging, he offers Eli a wager that's really just a death sentence with extra steps. Break the devil horse by sundown, or join the bones scattered around its pen. What the sheriff doesn't know is that Eli once had a gift with horses, back before life broke him down. As the sun climbs higher and the whole town gathers to watch what they're sure will be a man's final moments, something unexpected begins to happen between the broken drifter and the untamable beast. Could it be that some connections run deeper than fear itself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days earlier, Eli Cade had ridden into Dustwater with nothing more than the clothes on his back and a worn leather saddlebag that held what remained of his former life. The bag sagged with the weight of memory, a few crumpled letters, a harmonica that belonged to his father, and buried beneath it all, a faded photograph he couldn't bear to look at anymore. Dustwater wasn't much to speak of, just another frontier town carved out of hardscrabble earth and held together by stubbornness and whiskey. But it had what Eli needed: anonymity. Nobody here knew who he used to be, and that suited him fine. The man he'd been before had died, along with everything else he'd loved. Sheriff Wade Hawkins ruled Dustwater with the kind of iron fist that frontier towns seemed to breed. He was a man who understood that fear was more useful than respect, and he'd built his reputation on making examples of anyone who crossed him. The jail behind his office held the rusted remnants of leg irons and the bitter smell of desperation. On the wall hung a collection of wanted posters, some so old the faces had faded to ghosts. Doc Henley had been the first person to show Eli any kindness. The old physician ran the town's only medical practice from a cramped office above the general store, and he had the gentle manner of a man who'd seen enough suffering to know that healing came in many forms. When Eli had stumbled into his office that first day, nursing a fever from infected wounds on his hands, Doc had asked no questions and accepted no payment. "Every man's got his ghosts," Doc had said, cleaning the wounds with practiced care. "The trick is learning to live with them instead of letting them eat you alive." Martha Kellerman ran the Dustwater saloon with the efficiency of a woman who'd learned early that survival meant staying 2 steps ahead of trouble. She served whiskey that could strip paint and kept a loaded shotgun behind the bar. But there was warmth in her eyes for those who earned it. Her husband had been killed in a cattle drive 5 years back, leaving her to raise their boy Tommy alone. Young Tommy was 8 years old and fascinated by horses in the way that only children can be. He spent his afternoons carving wooden horses from scraps of wood, each one more detailed than the last. His eyes would light up whenever he spotted a rider coming into town, and he knew the lineage and temperament of every horse in Dustwater. It was Tommy who first told Eli about the devil horse. "Nobody's ever rode him," the boy had whispered conspiratorially as they sat on the saloon's front porch. "They say he's killed 3 men who tried. Sheriff keeps him penned up behind the jail, and sometimes at night you can hear him screaming like something out of hell itself." Eli had nodded politely, but his hands had trembled as he reached for his coffee cup. He'd heard that scream before, in nightmares that visited him every time he closed his eyes. It was the sound of a creature that had lost everything, just like him. The devil horse had a reputation that stretched across 3 territories. He was a black stallion, standing 17 hands high, with a coat so dark it seemed to absorb light. His eyes burned with an intelligence that unnerved even experienced horsemen, and his temperament was legendary. He'd been captured 2 years ago after a chase that lasted 3 days and cost 2 horses their lives. Since then, he'd been Sheriff Hawkins' prize and his curse. "That horse is worth more than this whole town," Martha had explained to Eli one evening as she wiped down glasses. "But what good's a horse nobody can ride? Sheriff's too proud to sell him and too stubborn to put him down. So there he sits, eating money and scaring children." Eli had listened to these stories with the detached interest of a man who'd sworn off caring about anything. He'd found work mucking stalls at the livery stable, mindless labor that kept his hands busy and his thoughts from wandering down dangerous paths. The stable owner, a gruff man named Pete, paid little and asked fewer questions. But Eli's carefully constructed anonymity began to crumble the moment he stepped into that jail cell, accused of a crime he hadn't committed. The accusation had come from Jeremiah Black, a neighboring rancher with political aspirations and a grudge against anyone who couldn't defend themselves. Black claimed he'd seen Eli near his property line the night his prize mare went missing. It was a lie, but lies had power in a place like Dustwater, especially when they came from men with money. Sheriff Hawkins had arrested Eli without ceremony, dragging him from the stable in front of half the town. The evidence was circumstantial at best. Eli had been seen in the area, and his reputation as a drifter made him an easy target. But Hawkins wasn't interested in evidence. He was interested in putting on a show. "I could hang you right now," the sheriff had said, leaning back in his chair as Eli stood shackled before his desk. "Save the town the cost of a trial, but where's the entertainment in that?" That's when Hawkins had made his proposal. The cruel wager that would either free Eli or kill him. The devil horse had become more than just a dangerous animal in the sheriff's hands. He was a weapon, a means of dispensing frontier justice that satisfied the crowd's appetite for spectacle while maintaining the sheriff's reputation for creative punishment. The rules were simple. Eli had until sundown to break the devil horse. If he succeeded, all charges would be dropped and he'd be free to go. If he failed, if the horse threw him, injured him, or simply refused to be ridden, he'd hang at dawn. The town had received the news with the enthusiasm of people starved for entertainment. Within hours, betting pools had formed. The odds were heavily against Eli, and most folks were already planning where to stand for the best view of what they assumed would be his final moments. But as Eli sat in his cell that first night, staring at the worn leather saddlebag that held the remnants of his past, he felt something stirring inside him that he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't hope. He'd learned better than to trust in hope. It was something quieter and more dangerous. Recognition. Through the barred window of his cell, he could hear the devil horse moving restlessly in his pen. The sound of hooves against hard earth, the occasional snort of frustration, the rattle of chains against wooden rails. But underneath it all, Eli could hear something else, a loneliness so profound it made his own pale by comparison. Maybe, he thought, as he finally drifted off to sleep, broken things were meant to find each other after all. The morning sun cast long shadows through the jail's barred windows when Sheriff Hawkins arrived to make his announcement official. He wore his silver star with the pride of a man who'd never questioned whether he deserved it, and his boots rang against the wooden floor with the confidence of absolute authority. "Time to make this interesting, Cade," Hawkins said, pulling up a chair backwards and straddling it like he was settling in for a friendly chat. "The whole town's talking about our little arrangement. Figured we ought to give them something worth watching." Eli remained silent, studying the man who held his life in his hands. Hawkins was younger than he'd first appeared, maybe 45, with the kind of smooth, good looks that helped win elections in small towns. But his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd learned that power was easier to maintain through fear than through justice. "You know what that horse has done to the last 3 men who tried to ride him?" Hawkins continued, clearly enjoying himself. "First one lasted maybe 10 seconds before he threw him into the fence posts. Broke his neck clean through. Second fellow was a professional bronc rider from Denver. The horse didn't just throw him, he stomped on him until there wasn't much left to bury. The third one, well, That horse took his time with that poor bastard. The sheriff stood and began pacing, warming to his subject. That animal's got a taste for blood now. Keeps him mean, keeps him interested. Some horses break eventually. You know, get tired of fighting and just give up. But not this one. Every day he gets a little crazier, a little more dangerous, like he's saving it all up for something special. Through the window, Eli could see townspeople beginning to gather in the street. Word had spread quickly through Dustwater, and folks were already staking out viewing positions for the afternoon's entertainment. Some brought chairs, others carried lunch baskets, as if they were settling in for a church social rather than what they expected to be, a man's gruesome death. "You could just let me go," Eli said quietly, speaking for the first time since his arrest. "We both know I didn't steal any horse." Hawkins laughed, a sound without warmth or humor. "Maybe you did. Maybe you didn't. Don't matter much now. See, this town's been getting a little too comfortable lately. People start thinking they can question my authority, maybe even vote me out come election time. But after today, after they see what happens to troublemakers, well, I expect folks will remember why they need a strong sheriff." The truth hit Eli like a physical blow. This wasn't about justice or stolen horses, it was about politics and power. He was nothing more than a convenient sacrifice, a drifter with no connections and no one to mourn him. The perfect victim for Hawkins' public demonstration of authority. "Course, if you want to back out, I could always just hang you now," Hawkins continued with mock generosity. "Save you the embarrassment of getting torn apart in front of the whole town. Might even make it quick." "I'll take my chances with the horse," Eli replied. Something flickered in Hawkins' eyes, disappointment maybe, or concern. The sheriff had been counting on fear to break Eli's resolve, to make him beg for a quick death instead of the slow torture he'd planned. But Eli's calm acceptance seemed to unsettle him. "Your funeral," Hawkins said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Literally." As the sheriff left, Eli closed his eyes and listened to the sounds drifting through his window. The devil horse was awake now, moving restlessly in his pen. The sound of his hooves had a rhythm to it, almost like a heartbeat, and occasionally Eli could hear the animal's breath, harsh and labored with frustration. The pen itself was a marvel of frontier engineering, built specifically to contain the most dangerous horse anyone in these parts had ever seen. The walls were 8 feet high and reinforced with iron bars, designed more like a prison cell than a stable. The gate was a massive thing that required 2 men to open, held shut by a series of heavy bolts and chains. Around the pen's perimeter, the ground was littered with the debris of previous attempts to break the horse. Broken saddles, torn ropes, pieces of leather and metal that told the story of violent encounters. And there, partially buried in the dust, were the bones Hawkins had mentioned, stark white reminders of what happened to men who underestimated the creature inside those walls. The devil horse himself was magnificent in his fury. Standing in the center of his prison, he was every inch the wild stallion, untouched by human influence or affection. His coat gleamed like polished obsidian, and his mane flowed like black water when he moved. His eyes were the color of dark amber, intelligent and filled with a rage that seemed to burn from somewhere deep inside. But as Eli watched through his cell window, he began to notice something the townspeople had missed. The horse's anger wasn't random or chaotic, it had purpose. Every kick at the fence posts, every charge at the gate, every defiant scream was calculated. The animal wasn't just fighting his captivity, he was studying it, testing it, looking for weakness. Smart bastard, isn't he? Eli turned to find Doc Henley standing outside his cell, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, and concern etched deep in his weathered face. "Doc," Eli acknowledged, "come to wish me luck? Come to see if you've lost your mind." Doc replied bluntly, "That horse has killed 3 men, Eli. 3 good men who knew their way around horses. What makes you think you can do what they couldn't?" Eli accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "Maybe I can't, But hanging's certain death. The horse is just probable death. I'll take my chances with probable." Doc studied him with the sharp eyes of a man trained to see past surface symptoms to underlying conditions. "There's something you're not telling me, isn't there? Something about why you're not more scared than you ought to be." For a moment, Eli considered telling the truth, about who he used to be, about the gift he'd once possessed, about the reasons he'd lost it all. But the words wouldn't come. That man was dead, and digging up his grave wouldn't help anyone. "Just a feeling," he said instead. Outside, the crowd was growing larger. Eli could see Martha Kellerman setting up a refreshment stand, her business sense overriding any sympathy she might feel for his situation. Young Tommy sat on a crate beside her, whittling another wooden horse and stealing glances at the jail. Even from a distance, Eli could see the boy's conflicted expression, part excitement, part worry. The devil horse chose that moment to let out one of his legendary screams, a sound that cut through the morning air like a knife. The crowd outside went quiet for a moment, reminded of exactly what kind of creature they'd come to see unleashed. But Eli smiled, because buried in that scream, he'd heard something no one else could detect, a note of recognition, as if the horse knew he was watching, as if, somehow, the animal had been waiting for him all along. Doc Henley lingered by the cell long after most visitors would have left, his medical bag resting at his feet like a faithful dog. The morning sun had climbed higher, and with it came the steady stream of townspeople wanting to get a look at the man who'd volunteered to dance with death. "You know," Doc said, settling into the chair Hawkins had vacated, "I've been practicing medicine for 37 years. Seen men face all kinds of endings, some brave, some cowardly, most somewhere in between. But I've never seen anyone as calm as you are right now." Eli sipped his coffee and watched the devil horse through the window. The stallion had settled into a restless patrol of his pen, wearing a groove in the hard earth as he circled endlessly. "Maybe I'm just too stupid to be scared." "That's not it." Doc leaned forward, studying Eli's face with professional interest. "You've got the look of a man who's already died once and isn't much concerned about doing it again. Question is, what killed you the first time?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Eli felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever someone got too close to the truth. He'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of being nobody, of existing without a past or future, just the endless present moment of putting one foot in front of the other. "Sometimes life just wears a man down," he said finally. Doc nodded slowly. "Sometimes it does. But sometimes it prepares him for something he never saw coming." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Honey and herbs. Good for keeping your strength up if you don't eat much beforehand. Some men get nervous stomachs before facing something like this." Eli accepted the pouch, touched by the gesture despite himself. "You think I've got a chance?" "I think," Doc said carefully, "that there's more to you than meets the eye. And I think that horse out there might be the same way." As if summoned by their conversation, the devil horse appeared at the window side of his pen, close enough that Eli could see the intelligence burning in those amber eyes. For a long moment, man and beast regarded each other through the glass and iron bars. Two prisoners preparing for their appointment with fate. "He knows you're watching him," Doc observed. "Never seen him do that before. Usually he ignores the Gawkers completely." The observation sent a chill down Eli's spine, because it confirmed what he'd been trying not to think about since his arrest. There was something familiar about this horse, something that tugged at memories he'd buried so deep he'd thought they were gone forever. Before he could examine the feeling further, Martha Kellerman appeared at the cell door, her son Tommy trailing behind her. She carried a plate covered with a checkered cloth, and her expression held the careful neutrality of someone trying not to take sides in a situation beyond her control. "Brought you some breakfast," she said, passing the plate through the bars. "Figured you ought to eat something substantial before this afternoon." The food was simple but well-prepared: eggs, bacon, biscuits still warm from the oven. It was the kind of meal a woman might make for her own family, and Eli found himself unexpectedly moved by the kindness. "Thank you," he said simply. Tommy pressed closer to the bars, his young eyes wide with curiosity. "Mister, are you really going to try to ride the devil horse?" "Tommy," Martha warned, but Eli held up a hand. "It's all right." He knelt down, so he was at eye level with the boy. "Yes, I'm going to try. Nobody's ever done it before," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "Not even Jake Morrison, and he was the best rider in 3 counties. "Sometimes," Eli replied, "the best rider isn't the right rider." The boy considered this with the serious concentration of someone far older than his years. What makes someone the right rider? Is the might? It was a good question, one that Eli had been asking himself since the wager was made. In the old days, before everything fell apart, he would have known the answer instinctively. But now, sitting in a jail cell waiting to face an impossible task, he wasn't sure he remembered. "Understanding, I suppose," he said finally. "Knowing what the horse needs instead of just what you want from him." Tommy's face lit up with excitement. "That's what my pa used to say. He said horses were like people. They just needed someone to listen to them proper." Martha's expression softened at the mention of her late husband. "Your father was a good man with horses," she agreed. "Never met one he couldn't gentle, given time." "Did he ever try to ride the devil horse?" Eli asked. "Lord, no," Martha replied with a bitter laugh. "That animal didn't show up until after my husband was gone. But knowing Tom, he would have tried. That man never could resist a challenge." Through the window, Eli could see the crowd growing steadily larger. Word had spread beyond Dustwater now, and riders were coming in from neighboring towns to witness the spectacle. He spotted several men in expensive suits who could only be wealthy ranchers, drawn by the legendary reputation of the devil horse and the morbid entertainment value of watching someone try to tame him. "Lot of folks betting against you," Tommy said with the blunt honesty of childhood. "Tommy!" Martha scolded, but the boy pressed on. "What are the odds now, Ma?" 20-1, Martha admitted reluctantly. "Most folks figure you'll last maybe 30 seconds. Eli had to laugh at that. Optimistic of them. But the laughter died in his throat when he saw Sheriff Hawkins approaching with Jeremiah Black at his side. The rancher who'd made the false accusation looked pleased with himself, like a man who'd set a clever trap and was eager to see it spring. "How's our guest this morning?" Hawkins asked with false cheer. "Ready for his big performance?" Black studied Eli through the bars with undisguised satisfaction. "Never seen a man so eager to die," he said. "Must have a guilty conscience." The comment was clearly intended to provoke, but Eli remained silent. He'd learned long ago that men like Black fed on reaction, and the best way to handle them was to give them nothing to feast on. "Course, there's still time to confess," Hawkins added. "Tell us where you hid my horse, and I might consider reducing your sentence to a simple hanging." "I didn't steal your horse," Eli said quietly, "and we all know it." Black's face darkened. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm stating a fact." The tension in the cell corridor became thick enough to cut. Martha gathered Tommy closer to her side, while Doc Henley's hand drifted casually toward his medical bag, and the pistol Eli suspected was hidden inside it. But before the situation could escalate further, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the window, Eli could see people pointing and talking excitedly about something in the direction of the devil horse's pen. The stallion was standing perfectly still at the center of his prison, but he was facing directly toward the jail. His head was raised high, ears pricked forward, as if he was listening for something only he could hear. The pose was so unusual, so completely different from his normal restless pacing, that even the most casual observers could tell something had changed. "What's gotten into him?" Hawkins muttered, moving to the window for a better view. But Eli already knew. The horse had been waiting, just as he had been waiting. And now, with the sun climbing toward its zenith and their appointment growing near, the waiting was almost over. The afternoon stretched toward its inevitable conclusion with the slow persistence of honey poured from a jar. Eli had finished Martha's breakfast and was now sitting quietly on his narrow cot, his worn leather saddlebag open beside him. For the first time in 2 years, he'd allowed himself to look at the contents, really look at them, instead of just shoving his hand inside to grab what he needed. The letters were from his wife, Sarah, 23 of them, written during the months when his reputation as a horse whisperer had taken him away from home more often than either of them liked. Her handwriting was neat and careful, full of news about their small ranch and gentle complaints about his extended absences. The last one, dated just 2 weeks before the accident, ended with the words, "Come home soon, my love. The horses miss you, but not nearly as much as I do." Beneath the letters was his father's harmonica, tarnished with age, but still capable of producing the soft, haunting melodies that had once gentled the wildest stallions. Old Henrik Cade had taught his son that music was the universal language of trust, that a horse's heart could be reached through rhythm and tone as surely as through grain and kindness. At the very bottom of the bag, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was the photograph. Eli's hands trembled as he unwrapped it, revealing the faces he'd tried so hard to forget. There he was, 20 pounds heavier and a lifetime younger, standing between Sarah and their prize stallion, Thunder. The horse was a magnificent bay with intelligent eyes and a coat that gleamed like burnished copper in the sunlight. Thunder had been the crown jewel of their small operation, a stallion whose bloodline traced back to the finest Arabian stock. But more than that, he'd been Eli's partner, the horse that had helped establish his reputation across 3 territories. Together, they gentled mustangs that other men had written off as unbreakable, turned wild creatures into willing partners through patience and understanding rather than force and fear. "That's a fine-looking horse." Eli looked up to find Tommy Kellerman standing outside his cell, having slipped away from his mother while she was busy with her refreshment stand. The boy's eyes were fixed on the photograph with the reverence of someone who recognized true quality when he saw it. "His name was Thunder," Eli said, surprised by how easily the words came. "Was." The simple question hit harder than any of Sheriff Hawkins's threats. "He's gone now." Tommy studied the photograph more intently, taking in every detail with the careful attention of a young person trying to understand adult mysteries. "You look different in the picture, happier." It was an astute observation from someone so young. The man in the photograph was indeed happy, content with his life, secure in his abilities, surrounded by everything he loved. That man had believed the future was predictable, that skill and dedication were enough to protect what mattered most. "I was different then," Eli admitted. "What happened?" The boy's innocent question opened wounds that Eli had thought were finally healed. For a moment, he was back in that terrible night 2 years ago, watching his world burn while he stood powerless to stop it. The memory came flooding back with perfect, agonizing clarity, the smell of smoke, the sound of screaming horses, the sight of Sarah running toward the burning stable to save an animal that was already lost. "Sometimes bad things happen," he said finally, "and sometimes there's nothing you can do to stop them." Tommy nodded solemnly. "Like when my pa died on the cattle drive. Ma says it wasn't anybody's fault, that sometimes the river just takes what it wants." The comparison was more apt than the boy realized. Death was indeed like a river, sudden, powerful, and utterly indifferent to human plans or prayers. It had taken Sarah and Thunder in one terrible night, leaving Eli alone with nothing but guilt and the ashes of everything he'd built. "Your ma's a smart woman," Eli said. "She likes you," Tommy confided, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I can tell. She gets the same look when she talks about you that she used to get when she talked about Pa." The observation made Eli uncomfortable in ways he didn't want to examine. Martha Kellerman was a good woman who deserved better than a broken-down drifter, carrying more ghosts than a man ought to bear. But there was something comforting about the idea that someone could look at him and see something worth liking, even if they didn't know the whole truth. "Tommy!" Martha's voice carried across the street, sharp with worry. "Get away from there." The boy grinned and waved at his mother. "I better go before she gets really mad. Good luck with the devil horse, Mr. Eli." As Tommy scampered back to the safety of his mother's side, Eli carefully rewrapped the photograph and returned it to his saddlebag. The brief glimpse into his past had been painful, but somehow necessary, like cleaning out an infected wound that had been left to fester too long. Through the window, he could see the crowd had grown to impressive proportions. It seemed like half the territory had turned out to watch the afternoon's entertainment. Men in work clothes stood shoulder to shoulder with prosperous-looking ranchers. Women in their Sunday dresses shared gossip while keeping careful watch over excited children. Even a few members of the local clergy had arrived, though whether to offer last rites or simply satisfy their curiosity was unclear. The devil horse had resumed his restless pacing, but there was something different about his movement now. Where before his circuits of the pen had seemed aimless, driven by frustration and captivity, now they had purpose. He was preparing himself, just as Eli was preparing himself, for the confrontation that would determine both their fates. Sheriff Hawkins appeared again, this time accompanied by his deputy and two men Eli didn't recognize. One was elderly and well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The other was younger, wearing the kind of expensive clothes that marked him as either wealthy or foolish enough to dress above his station. "Gentlemen," Hawkins announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man about to collect on a profitable wager, "meet our volunteer. Eli Cade. These are Judge Morrison and his son Jake. They've ridden down from the county seat especially to witness this afternoon's proceedings." Judge Morrison studied Eli with the cool assessment of someone who'd spent decades evaluating men's character from the bench. "Son, I presume you understand the nature of your situation." "Yes, sir." "And you're proceeding voluntarily?" "As voluntary as it gets when the alternative is hanging." The judge's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps approval for Eli's honesty, or maybe just professional interest in watching a man face his own mortality with such calm determination. Jake Morrison, however, was less composed. "That's the horse that killed my brother," he said, his voice tight with old grief and fresh anger. "If you're planning some kind of trick, no tricks," Eli replied simply. "Good," Jake said, "because I want to see that animal put down. Should have been done 2 years ago, right after Tommy died." So, that's where Eli had heard the name Morrison before. Tommy Morrison, the professional bronc rider who'd been the devil horse's second victim. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, painting a picture of grief and politics that went deeper than simple frontier justice. The sun was now directly overhead, casting short shadows and bathing the dusty street in harsh light. In a few hours, those same shadows would stretch long across the ground, marking the approach of sundown and the moment when all debts would be settled. Eli closed his eyes and listened to the sounds outside, the murmur of the crowd, the creak of wooden buildings expanding in the heat, and underneath it all, the steady rhythm of hooves on hard earth as the devil horse continued his endless patrol. Soon, he thought, soon they would meet face to face, and the world would discover whether two broken creatures could somehow find healing in each other, or if they were simply destined to complete each other's destruction. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon when Sheriff Hawkins finally came to collect his prisoner. The crowd outside had swollen to what might have been the largest gathering in Dustwater's brief history, and the air buzzed with anticipation and the sound of money changing hands as last-minute bets were placed. "Time to go, Cade," Hawkins announced, his keys jangling with nervous energy. "Folks are getting restless, and I'd hate to keep them waiting." Eli stood slowly, shouldering his leather saddlebag out of habit more than necessity. The weight of it felt different now, heavier with memory, but somehow less burdensome than it had been that morning. Facing the contents of his past, even briefly, had reminded him of who he used to be before grief had stripped away everything he thought he knew about himself. The walk from the jail to the devil horse's pen felt both endless and instant, like stepping through a doorway between two different worlds. The crowd parted before them, creating a corridor of curious faces and whispered commentary. Some looked at Eli with pity, others with the morbid fascination of people watching a man walk to his execution. A few, very few, seemed to hold something approaching hope. Martha Kellerman stood near the front of the crowd, with Tommy pressed close to her side. The boy clutched one of his wooden horse carvings, his knuckles white with tension. Doc Henley had positioned himself where he could reach the pen quickly if medical attention was needed, his bag open and his instruments laid out on a makeshift table. The practical preparations for catastrophe. The devil horse's pen loomed before them like a gladiator's arena, its 8-foot walls reinforced with iron bars that had been bent and dented by countless failed escape attempts. The gate itself was a masterwork of frontier engineering, thick wooden planks bound with steel and secured by no fewer than 6 heavy bolts. It had been built to contain the most dangerous horse anyone in these parts had ever seen, and it had never failed in that purpose. Around the pen's perimeter, the evidence of previous encounters lay scattered like offerings to some vengeful god. Broken saddles were piled in one corner, their leather cracked and their metal fittings twisted beyond recognition. Coils of rope hung from fence posts, some still bearing the frayed ends where they'd snapped under enormous pressure. And there, partially buried in the churned earth, were the bones that Sheriff Hawkins had mentioned, white reminders of what happened when human ambition met animal fury. But it was the horse himself that commanded attention. Standing in the center of his prison, he was 17 hands of barely contained lightning, every muscle defined beneath a coat so black it seemed to absorb the afternoon sunlight. His mane flowed like dark water when he moved, and his tail switched with the restless energy of a creature that had never known submission. His eyes were the color of amber, touched with fire, and they held an intelligence that unnerved even experienced horsemen. This wasn't the dull-witted fury of a broken animal. This was conscious, calculated rage, the anger of a creature that understood exactly what had been taken from him and was determined to make someone pay for it. When the devil horse caught sight of Eli approaching, his behavior changed dramatically. Where moments before he had been pacing restlessly, now he became utterly still. His head came up, ears pricked forward, and those burning eyes fixed on the man walking toward his pen with an intensity that made the crowd fall silent. "Jesus," someone whispered. "Look at him. It's like he knows." Sheriff Hawkins fumbled with the first bolt, his hands less steady than they had been in the jail. "Never seen him act like this before," he muttered. "Usually he goes crazy when people get too close." But the devil horse wasn't going crazy. He was watching, studying, evaluating the man who would either become his rider or his next victim. And in that watching, Eli saw something that struck him like a physical blow: recognition. The horse knew him, not personally, but essentially, the way one broken thing recognizes another. The first bolt slid free with a metallic screech that seemed to echo across the silent crowd. The second followed, then the third. With each bolt removed, the tension in the air grew thicker until it felt like everyone present was holding their breath. "You sure about this?" Hawkins asked, his hand hovering over the fourth bolt. "Last chance to back out and take the rope instead." Eli looked past the sheriff to the horse, waiting inside the pen. The stallion had moved closer to the gate, close enough that Eli could see the scars crisscrossing his magnificent hide, evidence of the battles he'd fought and the price he'd paid for his freedom. But he wasn't charging or screaming or displaying any of the violent behavior that had made him legendary. He was simply waiting, as if he understood that this moment was different from all the others. "I'm sure," Eli said. The remaining bolts came free in rapid succession, and the gate swung open with a groan of protest from hinges that had grown accustomed to staying closed. The crowd pressed forward, eager for the best view of what they expected to be a spectacular and violent confrontation. But instead of the expected charge or attack, something unprecedented happened. The devil horse took a single step backward, creating space between himself and the open gate. It was a gesture so subtle that most of the crowd missed its significance, but to anyone who understood horse behavior, it was as clear as spoken words. The stallion was offering an invitation rather than a threat. Eli stepped through the gate and into the pen, his movements slow and deliberate. The ground beneath his feet was hard-packed earth mixed with sand, churned into ruts by years of violent encounters. The smell hit him immediately: horse sweat, dust, and something else, something wild and untamed that spoke of open ranges and endless skies. The gate swung shut behind him with a finality that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. He was alone now with the most dangerous horse in 3 territories, separated from help by 8 feet of reinforced walls and the width of an arena that had become a graveyard for lesser men. The devil horse remained motionless, studying his unexpected visitor with those intelligent amber eyes. Up close, his size was even more impressive. He was larger than Thunder had been, with the kind of powerful build that spoke of speed and endurance bred into his very bones. But it was his stillness that was most unnerving, the complete absence of the frenzied behavior that had characterized all his previous encounters with humans. "Easy, boy," Eli said softly, his voice carrying the gentle tone he hadn't used in 2 years. "Easy now." The horse's ears flicked forward at the sound, and for a moment Eli could have sworn he saw something flicker in those burning eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. When was the last time someone had spoken to him as a partner rather than an adversary? Eli reached into his saddlebag and withdrew his father's harmonica. The metal was warm from his body heat, and the familiar weight of it in his hands brought back a flood of memories. Summer evenings on the ranch, Sarah laughing as Thunder danced to Eli Cade's melodies, the simple joy of communicating with another living creature through music rather than words. He raised the harmonica to his lips and began to play not the wild, driving rhythms that cowboys used to break horses, but something softer, more contemplative. It was a lullaby his father had taught him, a gentle melody that spoke of safety and home and the kind of love that asked nothing in return. The effect on the devil horse was immediate and profound. His head came up higher and his whole body seemed to relax slightly, as if some internal spring had been allowed to unwind just a notch. He took a tentative step forward, then another, drawn by sounds he hadn't heard since his capture. From outside the pen came the murmur of confused voices. This wasn't what the crowd had come to see. Where was the violence, the spectacle, the dramatic confrontation between man and beast? Instead, they were witnessing something entirely different, a conversation in a language older than words, conducted between 2 creatures who understood each other in ways that defied explanation. Eli continued playing, moving slowly around the perimeter of the pen, never approaching the horse directly, but always maintaining that gentle musical dialogue. The stallion followed his movements with his eyes, occasionally shifting position to keep the man in sight, but showing none of the aggressive behavior that had made him famous. And as the music flowed between them, bridging the gap between human and animal, civilized and wild, Eli began to understand what he was really facing. This wasn't just a dangerous horse that needed breaking. This was a creature whose spirit had been damaged by captivity and cruelty, who had learned to fight because fighting was the only response left to him. In that understanding, Eli recognized a reflection of his own journey from grace to desperation, from belonging to exile. They were both prisoners, both mourning losses that couldn't be recovered, both trapped in cycles of pain that seemed to have no end. But maybe, just maybe, they could find a way out together. The harmonica's gentle melody wove through the afternoon air like a silver thread, binding man and horse in a conversation that had nothing to do with dominance or submission and everything to do with recognition. Eli continued his slow circuit of the pen, never approaching the stallion directly, but always maintaining that musical dialogue that seemed to speak to something deep in the animal's soul. The devil horse followed his progress with those burning amber eyes, his head turning to track Eli's movement around the perimeter. But more telling was what he wasn't doing. There was no pawing at the ground, no laying back of ears, no baring of teeth. The signs of aggression that had preceded every other encounter were completely absent, replaced by something that could only be described as curiosity. From the crowd outside came a growing murmur of confusion and disappointment. This wasn't the blood sport they'd been promised. Where were the desperate attempts to throw a saddle on an unbroken horse? Where was the violence, the struggle, the dramatic confrontation that would end with either triumph or tragedy? "What's he doing in there?" someone called out, their voice carrying the frustration of a person who'd wagered good money on a spectacle that wasn't materializing. Sheriff Hawkins stood near the gate, his face a mask of growing concern. This peaceful interaction wasn't part of his plan. He needed Eli to fail dramatically and publicly, needed the lesson to be written in blood and terror so that no one in Dustwater would ever again question his authority. But instead of the quick, violent resolution he'd counted on, he was watching something that looked dangerously like success. Martha Kellerman held Tommy close to her side, but her expression had shifted from worry to wonder. She'd seen her late husband work with horses, had witnessed the gentle magic that could pass between a skilled horseman and a willing mount. What was happening in that pen looked familiar, not the forced breaking of an animal's spirit, but the careful building of trust between partners. Doc Henley had moved closer to the fence, his medical bag forgotten as he watched the unprecedented scene unfold. In all his years of treating the victims of horse-related accidents, he'd never seen anything quite like this. The devil horse, the creature that had killed 3 men and terrorized a town, was behaving like a curious colt, encountering something new and potentially wonderful. Eli let the last notes of the lullaby fade into silence and stood quietly at the far side of the pen, giving the horse time to process what had just happened. The stallion remained motionless for a long moment, then took a tentative step forward. Then another. His movement was cautious but not fearful, the careful approach of a creature who had learned to expect pain but was beginning to hope for something different. "That's it, boy," Eli murmured, his voice barely audible even to those pressed against the fence. "Take your time. No hurry at all." The horse continued his slow approach until he was perhaps 10 feet away, close enough to strike if he chose, but far enough to escape if the situation turned threatening. There he stopped, studying Eli with an intensity that made the air between them seem to shimmer with possibility. It was then that Eli did something that made the crowd gasp collectively. He turned his back on the devil horse. It was either the gesture of a madman or someone who understood horse psychology better than anyone in Dustwater had imagined. By removing the perceived threat of direct eye contact and showing his vulnerability, Eli was offering the ultimate display of trust. He was telling the stallion, in the clearest possible terms, that he was not there as a conqueror, but as a potential partner. The horse's response was immediate and profound. He moved closer, his hooves making soft sounds in the churned earth until his breath was warm against Eli's neck. The crowd held its collective breath, certain they were about to witness a man being torn apart by the most dangerous horse in the territory. Instead, they saw something that would be talked about in hushed, reverent tones for years to come. The devil horse, gently nuzzling Eli's shoulder, his velvet muzzle exploring this strange human who spoke to him in music instead of commands. "Sweet Jesus," someone whispered from the crowd. "He's gentling him." Eli turned slowly, moving with the careful precision of someone who understood that trust, once offered, could be shattered by a single wrong gesture. The horse didn't retreat, but continued his gentle exploration, learning Eli's scent and presence the way horses had been learning about potential partners for thousands of years. "You remember, don't you?" Eli said softly, his words meant for the horse, but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "You remember what it was like before all this, when humans meant partnership instead of pain?" The stallion's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, and those intelligent eyes seemed to focus with new intensity. There was something in Eli's tone, something in his presence, that resonated with memories the horse had thought were lost forever. From his saddlebag, Eli withdrew a piece of Martha's breakfast biscuit, saved from the morning meal. He held it out in his open palm, offering it not as a bribe but as a gift, a gesture of friendship that asked for nothing in return. The devil horse approached the offered treat with the same cautious curiosity he'd shown throughout their encounter. His muzzle investigated the biscuit, his breath warm against Eli's palm, before he delicately accepted the food. The gesture was so gentle, so completely at odds with his fearsome reputation, that several women in the crowd actually sighed audibly. But it was what happened next that truly stunned everyone present. As the horse finished the biscuit, he lowered his great head and rested his forehead against Eli's chest, the ultimate gesture of trust and acceptance in the equine world. It was a position that left him completely vulnerable, an acknowledgement that he no longer saw the man before him as a threat. The symbolism wasn't lost on Eli. In that moment, he felt something stirring inside him that he'd thought was dead forever, the old connection, the gift his father had called horse sense, but which was really something deeper and more mysterious. It was the ability to see past the surface to the wounded spirit beneath, to recognize that healing sometimes required nothing more than understanding and patience. Sheriff Hawkins chose that moment to assert his authority. "Enough of this," he called out, his voice cutting through the magical silence like a blade. The wager was to ride the horse, not pet him like a lapdog. Mount up or forfeit. The harsh words and demanding tone had an immediate effect on the devil horse. His head came up sharply, ears pinned back, and all the relaxed trust he'd been showing evaporated in an instant. He spun away from Eli, his hooves striking sparks from the hard ground, and for a moment it looked like the careful progress of the past hour was about to be destroyed by a few thoughtless words. But Eli was ready for the reaction. Without moving from his position, he began to hum softly, not the lullaby this time, but something deeper and more primal, a wordless song that seemed to come from some ancient place where humans and horses first learned to trust each other. The sound reached the stallion like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of panic and rage. He stopped his defensive spinning and turned toward Eli, his breathing heavy but his eyes no longer showing the wild fury that had made him legendary. "It's all right," Eli said, his voice carrying across the pen with calm authority. "He doesn't understand. But you do, don't you? You know the difference between force and friendship." The horse approached again, more slowly this time, but with growing confidence. And as he drew near, Eli reached into his saddlebag once more, not for food or music this time, but for something that made the crowd murmur with surprise and recognition. It was a saddle, but not like any they'd seen before. The leather was worn smooth by years of use, and the craftsmanship was exquisite, every piece fitted with the precision of someone who understood that a saddle was more than just equipment. It was the interface between two different worlds. Silver conchos caught the afternoon light, and the stirrups hung at exactly the right length for a man of Eli's height. But most remarkable of all was the devil horse's reaction to seeing it. Instead of the violent rejection that had greeted every previous attempt to saddle him, he stood quietly, watching with those intelligent eyes as Eli approached with the worn leather in his hands. "This was made for you," Eli said softly, holding the saddle where the horse could see and smell it. "A long time ago, for a horse just like you, it's been waiting for the right partner." And in that moment, as the afternoon sun slanted through the dust motes floating in the air around them, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple breaking of a wild horse. They were seeing the moment when two damaged souls recognized each other and chose healing over isolation, trust over fear. The devil horse stepped forward and gently nuzzled the saddle, accepting it not as a symbol of his defeat, but as a bridge to a better future. The saddle settled onto the devil horse's back as if it had been made for him, which, as the crowd would soon learn, it had been. The stallion stood perfectly still as Eli adjusted the familiar leather, his behavior so completely contrary to his fearsome reputation that the silence stretching across the gathered townspeople felt almost sacred. It was then that Judge Morrison's voice cut through the quiet, sharp with recognition and growing astonishment. "Dear God in heaven, that's Henrik Cade's saddle." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow, sending ripples of whispered conversation spreading outward from those who understood their significance. Henrik Cade, the legendary horse whisperer whose name was spoken with reverence from California to the Mississippi, the man who could gentle any horse, no matter how wild or broken. Sheriff Hawkins went pale as the implications began to sink in. "That's impossible. Henrik Cade died 5 years ago." "Henrik Cade did die 5 years ago," Judge Morrison replied, his voice gaining strength as the pieces fell into place. "But he had a son who was said to have inherited his father's gift tenfold." The judge's eyes fixed on Eli with laser intensity. "You're Elijah Cade, the horse whisperer of Thunder Creek." The words hung in the air like a revelation from on high, and suddenly everything made sense. Eli's calm acceptance of an impossible wager, his unprecedented success with the devil horse, the way the stallion had responded to him as if recognizing an old friend. The crowd pressed closer to the fence, eager to see the man whose reputation had been built on stories that seemed too incredible to be true. But it was the devil horse's reaction that confirmed what many were beginning to suspect. At the sound of Eli's real name, the stallion turned his great head and looked directly at him, his amber eyes bright with what could only be called joy. Then he did something that made several people in the crowd gasp aloud. He whinnied, a sound of pure happiness that was nothing like the screams of rage that had earned him his fearsome reputation. "You know him, don't you, boy?" Eli said softly, his hands continuing their gentle work with the saddle straps. "You remember Thunder Creek and the green pastures where you were foaled. You remember running free with your mother across those hills." Martha Kellerman was the first to put the rest of the pieces together, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "That's not just any horse, is it? That's Thunder's son. That's the colt from Thunder Creek that disappeared after the fire." The revelation hit Eli like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and making his hands tremble on the saddle leather. He'd suspected, hoped, feared, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that cut through the careful numbness he'd wrapped around his heart. "Tempest," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. "Your name is Tempest." The horse's response was immediate and overwhelming. He spun in a tight circle, his hooves dancing with an excitement that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with pure, unbridled joy. He was no longer the devil horse, the creature of fear and legend. He was Tempest, the colt who had been born during a thunderstorm at Thunder Creek Ranch, the foal who had shown such promise before the world fell apart. From the crowd came a collective intake of breath as people began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a man attempting to ride a dangerous horse. This was a reunion between partners who had been torn apart by tragedy and found each other again against impossible odds. Doc Henley moved closer to the fence, his medical knowledge allowing him to see details others might miss. "Look at those scars," he said quietly. "They're not from fighting. They're burn scars. That horse was in a fire." The truth of it all came flooding back to Eli in a rush of memories so vivid they might have happened yesterday instead of 2 years ago. The fire had started in the middle of the night, probably from a lantern knocked over in the feed room. By the time he'd awakened to the smell of smoke, half the stable was already engulfed in flames. He'd managed to save most of the horses, leading them to safety in the paddock, while Sarah worked desperately to calm the more frightened animals. But Tempest, then just a yearling, had panicked and bolted back into the burning stable, driven by some equine instinct to seek shelter in the only place he knew as home. Sarah had gone after him. Against Eli's desperate pleas, against all reason and safety, she had run into that blazing hell to save a horse she'd helped deliver and raised from birth. The ceiling had collapsed just as she reached Tempest's stall, trapping them both in an inferno that no living thing should have survived. Eli had tried to follow, had fought against the men holding him back with superhuman strength born of desperation and love, but it had been too late. By the time the fire burned itself out, there was nothing left but ashes and grief, and the horrible certainty that his failure to save them had destroyed everything that made life worth living. Except now, impossibly, Tempest was alive, scarred and traumatized, transformed from a gentle colt into the legendary devil horse, but alive. And if Tempest had survived, then maybe. "Where did you find him?" Eli asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Who brought him here?" Sheriff Hawkins looked like a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble around him. Horse trader named Wilson brought him in about 2 years ago. Said he'd captured him running wild in the hills, been living feral since some ranch fire killed his owners. The timeline fit perfectly, and with it came a possibility that Eli hardly dared to consider. If Tempest had survived the fire, if he'd been running wild in the hills, then maybe Sarah. But no. Even as the hope flared in his chest, reality crushed it down. Wilson would have mentioned finding human remains, would have brought word of survivors. The fire had taken Sarah, just as it had seemingly taken Tempest. The difference was that horses were harder to kill than humans, and a young stallion might survive injuries that would be fatal to a person. Still, the reunion with Tempest felt like receiving a piece of his soul back, a part of himself he'd thought was lost forever. And as he looked into those intelligent amber eyes, he saw not just recognition, but forgiveness, the kind of absolution that only came from a heart too pure to hold grudges. "I'm sorry, boy," Eli whispered, his forehead pressed against the stallion's neck. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you both, but you're here now, and that's what matters." Tempest turned his head and gently nuzzled Eli's shoulder, a gesture of comfort from a creature who had every right to hate the man who had failed to protect him. Instead, he was offering the kind of unconditional love that only horses seemed capable of, the forgiveness that came from recognizing shared pain and choosing connection over isolation. The crowd around the pen had fallen completely silent, awed by the depth of emotion they were witnessing. Even those who knew nothing about horses could see that something profound was happening between the man and the stallion, something that transcended the simple breaking of a wild animal. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, his voice gentler than it had been when he'd first recognized Eli's identity. "Son, if that horse means what I think he means to you, then Sheriff Hawkins' wager takes on a different character entirely. This isn't about breaking a dangerous animal, it's about healing old wounds." Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and desperation. His entire plan was collapsing around him, the carefully orchestrated spectacle turning into something that made him look like a fool or worse. "I don't care who he is or what horse that is. The wager stands. He has until sundown to ride that animal, or he hangs at dawn." But his words no longer carried the authority they had that morning. The crowd's mood had shifted, their bloodlust replaced by something approaching wonder. They were witnessing a miracle, the kind of story that would be told and retold for generations, and few of them wanted to see it end in violence. Eli straightened and looked around at the faces pressed against the fence. Martha's tears of joy, Tommy's wide-eyed amazement, Doc Henley's professional fascination, Judge Morrison's growing understanding of the injustice he'd been asked to witness. These people had come expecting to see a man die. Instead, they were seeing him come back to life. "The wager stands," he agreed, his voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there that morning. "But it's not about breaking him anymore. It's about remembering what we used to be, before the world broke us both." He swung up into the saddle with the fluid grace of someone born to ride, and Tempest stood steady as a rock beneath him, as if the 2 years of separation had been nothing more than a brief intermission in a conversation that had never really ended. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Eli heard none of it. All that mattered was the feeling of Tempest's powerful muscles bunching beneath him, the familiar rhythm of their shared heartbeat, and the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, the things we think we've lost forever find their way back to us when we need them most. The moment Eli settled into the saddle, something magical happened. The years of separation, the trauma and pain that had defined both their lives since the fire, seemed to melt away like frost before the morning sun. Tempest stood perfectly still for a heartbeat, as if savoring the feeling of his true partner on his back once again, then began to move with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill. It wasn't the violent bucking and spinning that everyone had expected from the devil horse. Instead, it was pure poetry in motion, the kind of partnership between horse and rider that most people only heard about in legends. Tempest moved as if he and Eli were one creature, responding to subtle shifts in weight and gentle pressure from hands and legs that spoke a language older than words. The crowd pressed against the fence in absolute silence, afraid that any sound might break the spell they were witnessing. Even the children had stopped their chatter, instinctively understanding that they were seeing something extraordinary, something that would live in their memories for the rest of their lives. Martha Kellerman wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the reunion unfold. "Tom always said some partnerships were written in the stars," she whispered to her son. "Guess he was right." Tommy clutched his wooden horse carving against his chest, his young mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The terrible devil horse that had haunted his nightmares was gone, replaced by a magnificent stallion who moved with his rider as if they'd never been apart. Doc Henley had abandoned his medical preparations entirely, his attention fixed on the incredible transformation taking place before his eyes. In all his years of treating both men and horses, he'd never seen anything that compared to the bond being displayed in that pen. It was as if two wounded souls were healing each other through nothing more than mutual recognition and acceptance. But it was Judge Morrison who perhaps understood best what was really happening. As a man who'd spent his life studying human nature from the bench, he could see that this wasn't just about a horse and rider. It was about redemption, forgiveness, and the power of love to overcome even the deepest trauma. "Sheriff," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of his position, "I think it's time you explained exactly how you came to possess this particular horse." Sheriff Hawkins looked like a man caught in a trap of his own making. His face had gone pale beneath his tan, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling afternoon air. "Horse trader brought him in, like I said, legal bill of sale and everything. From a man named Wilson, you said." The judge's tone was deceptively casual, but there was steel beneath the silk. "Curious thing about Bill Wilson, he's been in territorial prison for the past 18 months, cattle rustling, if I recall correctly." The words hit Hawkins like a physical blow, and several members of the crowd began to mutter among themselves as the implications sank in. If Wilson had been in prison when he supposedly sold the horse to Hawkins, then the entire transaction was either illegal or fabricated. Eli heard the exchange but didn't react visibly, his attention focused entirely on rebuilding the connection with Tempest that had sustained them both through their darkest days. The stallion responded to every subtle cue, moving through the complex patterns and maneuvers that had once made them legendary throughout the territory. It was like watching a master musician play a perfectly tuned instrument, each note building toward a crescendo of absolute harmony. "The devil," someone in the crowd whispered in awe. "They're dancing." And indeed they were. Tempest moved through lateral work that would have challenged the finest dressage horses, his hooves seeming to barely touch the ground as he floated through movements that demonstrated not just athletic ability, but complete trust in his rider. Eli sat deep in the saddle, his body moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to ride before he could properly walk, his hands gentle on the reins that were more symbolic than functional. As they moved together, Eli felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. The guilt and grief that had driven him into exile seemed suddenly lighter, not erased, but transformed into something more manageable. Tempest had forgiven him for failing to save them both from the fire, had chosen love over resentment, partnership over isolation. Maybe, Eli thought, it was time to forgive himself as well. But their reunion was interrupted by Sheriff Hawkins's increasingly desperate voice. "I don't care about any of that legal nonsense," he shouted, his authority slipping away like sand through his fingers. The wager was to ride the horse until sundown, and sunset still an hour away. For all we know, that animal's just waiting for the right moment to kill him. The words were intended to plant doubt in the crowd's mind, to remind them of the devil horse's fearsome reputation and the danger that Eli still faced. But they had the opposite effect, serving only to highlight how completely the situation had been transformed. The creature in that pen bore no resemblance to the murderous beast of legend. This was a horse in perfect harmony with his rider, moving with joy and precision that spoke of deep mutual trust. Jeremiah Black, the rancher who had made the false accusation that started this whole affair, pushed forward through the crowd. His face was flushed with anger, and something that might have been fear. "This is all very touching," he snarled, "but it doesn't change the fact that this man is a horse thief. I saw him near my property the night my mare disappeared." "Funny thing about that mare, Black," came a new voice from the edge of the crowd. A weathered man in travel clothes stepped forward, leading a familiar-looking horse by a simple rope halter. "Found her wandering loose about 10 miles north of here, still wearing your brand but with a different saddle entirely. Almost like someone turned her out on purpose, maybe to create a distraction while they conducted some other business." Black's face went white as he recognized the newcomer Sam Fletcher, a respected horse trader whose word carried weight throughout the territory. Fletcher's presence and the recovery of the supposedly stolen mare put an entirely different light on the accusations that had landed Eli in jail. "Matter of fact," Fletcher continued, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet crowd, "I've been tracking a ring of horse thieves operating out of this area for the better part of 6 months. Amazing how many stolen horses seem to find their way through certain official channels, all with proper-looking paperwork that don't hold up to close inspection. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel." Judge Morrison's expression had hardened into something that promised swift and uncompromising justice for anyone foolish enough to abuse their position of public trust. But Eli barely heard the unfolding drama around him, his attention focused entirely on the magnificent creature beneath him. Tempest was growing stronger with each passing moment, his movements becoming more fluid and confident as he remembered what it felt like to have a true partner on his back. The 2 years of captivity and abuse seemed to be falling away from him like an old coat, revealing the magnificent horse he'd been meant to become. As they moved together through increasingly complex maneuvers, Eli felt something stirring inside him that he'd thought was dead forever. It was hope, not the desperate, clinging hope of a drowning man, but the quiet, steady hope of someone who'd been lost in the darkness and finally glimpsed the light. He'd found Tempest again, against all odds and expectations, and if that miracle was possible, then maybe others were too. The sun was sinking lower in the western sky, casting long shadows across the dusty ground and painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Soon, very soon, the moment of reckoning would arrive, and Sheriff Hawkins's cruel wager would be settled once and for all. But as Eli guided Tempest through one final spectacular movement, a levade that saw the powerful stallion balanced perfectly on his hind legs, front hooves pouring the air like a creature from mythology, he realized that the outcome no longer mattered. He'd already won something more valuable than freedom or vindication. He'd found his way back to himself, and in doing so, had discovered that healing was possible, even for wounds that seemed too deep to mend. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause as Tempest settled back to all four hooves with the grace of a dancer completing a perfect pirouette. The sound washed over them like a tide of approval and wonder, but Eli barely heard it. His world had narrowed to the feeling of Tempest's powerful heartbeat beneath him, the familiar rhythm that had once been as natural as breathing. Sheriff Hawkins stood near the gate, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Everything he'd planned, the public spectacle, the demonstration of his authority, the elimination of an inconvenient drifter, had collapsed around him like a house of cards. Worse than that, the web of corruption that had sustained his position was beginning to unravel before his eyes, pulled apart by forces he'd never anticipated. "Time!" he called out desperately, though the sun was still well above the horizon. "The wager's complete. He's ridden the horse." But Judge Morrison stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of true justice. "I think we'll wait for actual sundown, Sheriff. After all, those were the terms you set." His eyes swept the crowd, taking in the faces of people who had come expecting entertainment and found something far more meaningful. "Besides, I have some questions about how this situation came to be in the first place." The judge's words sent a visible shiver through both Hawkins and Black, but Eli paid them no attention. He was lost in memories, transported back to better days when he and Tempest had worked together as partners, before fire and loss had torn their world apart. The stallion seemed to sense his rider's emotional journey, moving with gentle, soothing gaits that spoke of comfort and understanding. Martha Kellerman watched the reunion with tears streaming down her face, remembering her own husband and the way he'd spoken about the bond between a good horseman and his mount. "It's like watching a prayer answered," she whispered to Doc Henley. The old physician nodded, his trained eye taking in details others might miss. "Look at that horse's breathing," he said quietly. "Steady as a rock, heart rate normal. 2 hours ago he was a dangerous killer, and now he's as calm as an old plow horse. That's not training or technique, that's love." Tommy Kellerman pressed closer to the fence, his wooden horse carving forgotten in his excitement. "Will they stay together now?" he asked his mother. "Will they go back to their ranch?" Martha's expression darkened slightly as she considered the question. Even if Eli was cleared of all charges, which seemed increasingly likely given the revelations about Hawkins and Black's corruption, there was no ranch to return to. Thunder Creek had burned to the ground 2 years ago, taking with it everything Eli and his wife had built together. The man and horse might have found each other again, but they were still homeless, still refugees from a life that no longer existed. But those concerns seemed distant as the afternoon wore on, and the partnership between Eli and Tempest grew stronger with each passing moment. They moved through the pen like dancers responding to music only they could hear, demonstrating levels of communication and trust that most people had never imagined possible between human and horse. The sun continued its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. Soon, very soon, the moment of official sunset would arrive, and Sheriff Hawkins' cruel wager would be formally concluded. But everyone present understood that the real resolution had come much earlier, in the moment when a broken man and a damaged horse had recognized each other and chosen healing over hatred. As the golden light slanted through the dust motes floating around the pen, Eli guided Tempest to the center of their arena and brought him to a perfect halt. The stallion stood like a statue carved from living obsidian, every muscle defined but relaxed, his breathing deep, and even despite the complexity of the movements they'd just completed. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he'd used years ago when Tempest was just a curious colt learning about the world. "We did it. We found our way back to each other." The horse turned his great head slightly, amber eyes meeting his rider's gaze in a moment of perfect understanding. In that look was forgiveness for past failures, acceptance of present circumstances, and hope for whatever future they might build together. The crowd around the pen had grown quiet again, sensing that they were witnessing the culmination of something far more significant than a simple horse-breaking exhibition. This was about redemption and second chances, about the power of love to overcome even the deepest trauma. And in the growing twilight, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something that would live in their memories forever, the moment when two broken souls found healing in each other, proving that sometimes the most profound victories come not from conquering, but from connection, not from force, but from understanding. The sun touched the horizon like a golden coin balanced on the edge of the world, its light streaming across the dusty street of Dustwater and painting everything in shades of amber and fire. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived, the official end of Sheriff Hawkins' cruel wager and the formal resolution of a challenge that had transformed from spectacle into miracle. Judge Morrison stepped forward, his pocket watch gleaming in the fading light. "Sunset," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "The terms of the wager have been met." A cheer went up from the assembled townspeople, but it was different from the bloodthirsty roar they might have expected hours earlier. This was something deeper, more meaningful, the sound of people who had witnessed something that restored their faith in the possibility of goodness in a harsh world. Eli remained mounted on Tempest in the center of the pen, the two of them like a statue carved from living shadow against the brilliant sunset. The stallion stood perfectly still beneath him, breathing easy and calm, a creature utterly transformed from the legendary devil horse that had terrorized the territory for 2 years. "The charges are dismissed," Judge Morrison continued, his official tone unable to completely mask his own wonder at what he'd witnessed. "Eli Cade, you are free to go." But freedom, Eli realized, had come hours ago when he'd first touched Tempest's neck and felt the connection he'd thought was lost forever. The legal resolution was just paperwork compared to the healing that had taken place between them in that dusty pen. Sheriff Hawkins stood near the gate, his face a mask of barely controlled rage and fear. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and he knew it. The corruption that had sustained his position of power was being exposed thread by thread, unraveled by forces he'd never anticipated when he'd made his cruel wager that morning. "This isn't over," he snarled, his hand drifting toward the gun at his hip. "That horse is still stolen property, no matter who's riding him." "Actually," Sam Fletcher said, stepping forward with a sheaf of papers in his weathered hand, "I think you'll find that's not quite accurate." He handed the documents to Judge Morrison with the satisfaction of a man who'd been waiting for this moment. "Found these in Bill Wilson's saddlebags when they arrested him. Seems our friend Wilson kept detailed records of his business dealings, including a complete list of horses he sold to certain law enforcement officials, along with their true ownership and the prices paid." The judge's expression grew darker as he scanned the documents. "According to this, Sheriff, you've been purchasing stolen horses for the past 3 years, using territorial funds to pay inflated prices to known criminals." He looked up, his eyes hard as flint. "That's not just corruption, it's theft from the taxpayers you swore to serve." The crowd began to murmur, the sound growing louder as people realized the full scope of what they were hearing. Their sheriff, the man who'd ruled them through fear and claimed to represent justice, was nothing more than a common criminal who'd been stealing from his own community. Jeremiah Black tried to slip away through the crowd, but Sam Fletcher's voice stopped him cold. "Don't go far, Black. You're mentioned quite prominently in these records too. Amazing how many of your stolen horses ended up being sold back to you at bargain prices after they'd been reported missing." The rancher's face went white as the implications sank in. His scheme reporting his own horses as stolen so they could be recovered and sold back to him at reduced prices had seemed foolproof. But Wilson's meticulous record-keeping had documented every transaction, creating a paper trail that would be impossible to explain away. Eli watched the unfolding drama with detached interest, his attention focused primarily on the magnificent creature beneath him. Tempest was alert but calm, his ears pricked forward as he observed the humans sorting out their complicated affairs. The stallion understood, in the way that horses do, that the immediate danger had passed and they were safe. "What happens now?" Tommy Kellerman asked, his young voice cutting through the adult conversations with the clarity of innocence. It was a good question, and one that Eli had been asking himself since the moment he'd recognized Tempest. They'd found each other again, against all odds and expectations, but the world that had once sustained them was gone. Thunder Creek Ranch was ashes and memory, and even if it could be rebuilt, the woman who had made it home was buried in its ruins. Martha Kellerman seemed to sense his thoughts. She approached the pen with the quiet confidence of someone who'd made a difficult decision and found peace with it. "You'll need a place to stay while you sort things out," she said simply. "Dustwater could use a good horseman, and Tommy could use a man to teach him what his father never got the chance to." The offer was generous beyond words, and Eli felt something warm stirring in his chest at the thought of belonging somewhere again. But before he could respond, Doc Henley stepped forward with his own proposal. "Actually," the old physician said, "I've been thinking about retiring for some time now. My arthritis isn't getting any better, and this town's growing too fast for one doctor to handle alone." He looked directly at Eli, his eyes bright with possibility. "You've got healing hands. I saw it today with that horse. With some training, you could help people the same way you help animals." The suggestions came from hearts that had been touched by what they'd witnessed, offers of belonging from people who understood that some gifts were too precious to waste on solitude and grief. Eli felt overwhelmed by their generosity, humbled by their willingness to open their community to a man they'd met as a prisoner facing execution. But it was young Tommy's voice that cut through all the adult complexity with devastating simplicity. "Will you teach me to ride like that? Like you and Tempest?" The question hung in the air like a promise, carrying with it all the hope and possibility of a future that Eli had never dared to imagine. A future where his gift could be shared rather than buried, where his knowledge could help others rather than torment him with memories of what he'd lost. Tempest turned his great head slightly, amber eyes meeting his rider's gaze in a moment of perfect understanding. The stallion couldn't speak, but his message was clear. The past was gone, but the future was waiting. They could choose to remain prisoners of their grief, or they could honor what they'd lost by building something new and meaningful from the ashes. As the last light of day faded into purple twilight, Eli made his decision. He would stay in Dustwater, would accept the kindness being offered, would find new purpose in sharing the gifts he'd inherited from his father and refined through partnership with creatures like Tempest. The pain of loss would never fully disappear, but it could be transformed into something healing rather than destructive. The devil horse was dead, killed not by violence, but by love. In his place stood Tempest, partner and friend, ready to help his rider write a new chapter in a story that had seemed destined to end in tragedy. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky when Eli finally dismounted from Tempest, his feet touching the churned earth of the pen for the first time in hours. The stallion remained perfectly still beside him, close enough that Eli could feel the warmth radiating from his powerful body, solid and real and alive in ways that still seemed impossible. Judge Morrison approached the gate with measured steps, his official duties demanding attention, even as his personal amazement at what he'd witnessed continued to overwhelm his judicial composure. "Mr. Cade," he said formally, "you are hereby released from all charges. The territorial government will want to speak with you about recovering any other stolen horses that may be in circulation, but that's a matter for another day." Behind the judge, Sheriff Hawkins stood in shackles that had been provided by his own deputy, a young man named Collins, who'd apparently been waiting years for an opportunity to arrest his corrupt superior. The former sheriff's face was a mask of impotent rage, his dreams of power and intimidation crumbling as completely as his illegal schemes had been exposed. "This isn't over," Hawkins snarled one final time, his voice carrying the desperate venom of a cornered snake. "That horse is a killer, and sooner or later he'll show his true nature. Mark my words, someone's going to die because of your soft-hearted foolishness." Tempest's ears flicked at the harsh tone, but he showed no other reaction to the words that had once defined his reputation. The stallion had found his true nature, and it had nothing to do with the violence and fear that men like Hawkins had projected onto him. Eli placed a gentle hand on Tempest's neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath the scarred hide. "The only thing dying here tonight is fear," he said quietly. "Fear of what we don't understand, fear of things that are different, fear of opening our hearts to the possibility of healing." The crowd began to disperse as the official proceedings concluded, but many lingered, reluctant to let go of the magic they'd witnessed. Children pressed closer to the fence, hoping for one more glimpse of the magnificent horse who'd been transformed from monster to miracle before their eyes. Their parents chatted quietly among themselves, already beginning the process of turning the day's events into the kind of story that would be told and retold for generations. Martha Kellerman appeared at Eli's side with a set of clean clothes and a warm meal wrapped in cloth. "Figured you might want to get cleaned up," she said with maternal efficiency. "Tommy's been asking if he can help take care of Tempest, and I thought maybe you'd like the company." The boy in question stood nearby, practically vibrating with excitement and barely contained questions. His wooden horse carving was clutched tightly in his small hands, and his eyes never left Tempest's magnificent form. "He's beautiful," Tommy whispered in the reverent tone children reserved for things that exceeded their wildest dreams. "Is he really the devil horse? He doesn't look scary at all." Eli knelt down to the boy's level, remembering another child who'd once asked similar questions about a different horse in what felt like another lifetime. "He was never really the devil horse," he explained gently. "That was just a name people gave him when they were afraid and didn't understand what he needed." What did he need? It was such a simple question, but it cut straight to the heart of everything that had happened. "Someone to listen to him," Eli replied. "Someone to see past the anger and fear to the hurt underneath. Someone to remember that even the wildest things can be gentle if they're treated with kindness." Tommy nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson with the seriousness of someone much older. "Can I pet him?" Eli looked to Tempest, who lowered his great head with the patience of a creature who understood the importance of first impressions with children. "Hold your hand out flat, like this," Eli instructed, guiding Tommy's small fingers into the proper position. "Let him smell you first, so he knows you're a friend." The stallion's velvet muzzle investigated Tommy's outstretched palm with gentle curiosity, his breath warm against the child's skin. When he was satisfied with his examination, he allowed the boy to stroke his neck, a gesture of trust that made Tommy's face light up with pure joy. "He's so soft," Tommy marveled, "and warm. I thought he'd be cold and mean, like the stories said." "Stories aren't always true," Eli said. "Sometimes they just tell us what people want to believe instead of what really is." Doc Henley joined them at the fence, his medical bag slung over his shoulder, but his attention focused entirely on the peaceful scene before him. "In 40 years of practice, I've never seen anything that compared to what happened here today," he said quietly. "That kind of healing, it's what I went into medicine hoping to accomplish." The old physician's words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Here was a man who dedicated his life to healing, acknowledging that what he'd witnessed transcended anything he'd learned in medical school or achieved in decades of practice. It was healing of a different sort, not of the body but of the soul, not through medicine but through connection. As the evening deepened around them, practical concerns began to assert themselves. Tempest needed feed and water, shelter and care after his long ordeal. Eli needed food and rest, time to process the emotional magnitude of what had occurred. The crowd needed to return to their homes and lives, carrying with them the memory of something extraordinary that had reminded them why hope was worth maintaining even in the hardest times. But before they could turn to mundane matters, one final piece of business demanded attention. Sam Fletcher approached with another set of documents, these bearing official territorial seals and the weight of legal authority. "Thought you'd want to see these," he said, handing the papers to Eli. Wilson kept more than just records of stolen horses. Turns out he documented every transaction, including the insurance payments collected on properties that were supposedly destroyed in the Thunder Creek fire. Eli's hands trembled as he scanned the documents, their implications slowly sinking in. According to Wilson's meticulous records, the insurance company had paid substantial claims for the complete destruction of Thunder Creek Ranch, including all livestock and buildings. But the records also showed that several horses listed as dead had actually been captured and sold, their supposed deaths fabricated to support fraudulent claims. "Sarah," Eli whispered, his voice barely audible, "is there any mention of—" Fletcher's expression grew gentle with understanding. "I'm sorry, son. The records are pretty clear about the human casualties. Wilson might have been a horse thief, but he drew the line at covering up deaths. If your wife had survived, there would be some record of it." The words hit Eli like a physical blow, closing the door on a hope he'd barely dared to acknowledge. Sarah was truly gone, taken by the fire that had claimed so much of what he'd held dear. But somehow, the finality of it felt more healing than the uncertainty that had plagued him for 2 years. He could mourn her properly now, could honor her memory without the torture of wondering what might have been. Tempest seemed to sense his rider's emotional turmoil, stepping closer and resting his great head against Eli's shoulder in a gesture of comfort. The stallion couldn't bring back the dead or undo the tragedies of the past, but he could offer the steady presence of unconditional love, the kind that asked nothing and gave everything. As the last light faded from the western sky and the first lamps began to flicker to life in Dustwater's windows, Eli made a silent promise to the memory of his wife and the future of his partnership with Tempest. He would build something new from the ashes of what had been lost, would honor the past by creating meaning in the present, would prove that love could triumph over loss if it was given the chance to grow. 6 months later, the sunrise painted Dustwater's main street in shades of gold and promise, just as it had on that transformative day when 2 broken souls found healing in each other. But the town itself had changed in ways both subtle and profound, touched by the ripple effects of what everyone now simply called the day the devil horse came home. Eli stood in the doorway of what had once been the old livery stable, now expanded and renovated into something that served the community in ways its previous owner had never imagined. The Dustwater Healing Center, as Doc Henley had christened it, combined veterinary care with basic medical services, bringing together the healing of both human and animal under one roof. Through the large windows he'd installed, Eli could see Tempest in the paddock behind the building, his magnificent black coat gleaming in the morning light as Tommy Kellerman practiced the gentle riding techniques that had replaced the violent horse-breaking methods of the past. The boy had proven to be a natural horseman, blessed with the same intuitive understanding of equine psychology that had once made Eli famous throughout the territory. "He's getting better every day," Martha observed, joining Eli at the window with 2 cups of coffee steaming in the cool morning air. Tom would be proud to see his son learning to ride like that. The relationship between Eli and Martha had developed slowly, built on shared loss and mutual respect rather than the desperate passion of youth. They had both known great love and devastating grief, and perhaps that shared experience allowed them to appreciate the quieter, steadier affection that had grown between them. It wasn't the wild romance of his youth with Sarah, but it was real and healing and good. "Your husband was a wise man," Eli replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. He understood that partnership is always better than dominance. Through the window, they watched as Tommy guided Tempest through a series of movements that would have been impossible 6 months ago. The boy had absorbed his lessons with the eager enthusiasm of youth, but more than that, he'd developed the patience and empathy that marked truly gifted horsemen. Under his gentle guidance, several of the area's most difficult horses had been transformed from problems into partners. The success of their methods had drawn attention from across the territory. Ranchers, who had once relied on violent braking techniques, now sent their most challenging horses to Dustwater, knowing that Eli and Tommy could achieve results through understanding that force had never accomplished. The old ways were dying, replaced by something kinder and more sustainable. Doc Henley emerged from the medical wing of the building, his arthritis-gnarled hands steady despite his age, as he cleaned his instruments. The old physician had embraced his partial retirement with enthusiasm, spending his mornings treating human patients and his afternoons learning veterinary techniques that complemented his medical knowledge. "Mrs. Patterson's ready to go home," he announced. "That mare of hers should make a full recovery, thanks to your intervention. Amazing what a little patience and understanding can accomplish." The case had been typical of their recent successes, a supposedly vicious horse that had turned dangerous after years of harsh treatment. Under Eli's care, the mare had revealed herself to be simply frightened and in pain, her aggressive behavior a desperate attempt to protect herself from further harm. Now, properly treated and gently retrained, she was ready to return to a life of useful partnership with her owner. Judge Morrison had become a regular visitor to the center, his official duties often bringing him to Dustwater as the territorial government worked to root out the corruption that Hawkins and Black had represented. The former sheriff was now serving a lengthy sentence in the territorial prison, his political ambitions permanently derailed by his criminal activities. "Got some news that might interest you," the judge said, appearing in the doorway with his characteristic punctuality. "The territorial legislature has voted to establish formal standards for animal welfare, based largely on the methods you've developed here. They're calling it the Dustwater Protocol." The recognition was gratifying, but Eli found it less important than the daily evidence of positive change he witnessed in his work. Every horse that learned to trust again, every person who chose understanding over force, every child, like Tommy, who grew up believing in the possibility of partnership rather than dominance, these were the true measures of success. As the morning progressed, the center filled with its usual mixture of two-legged and four-legged patients. Mrs. Chen brought her arthritic gelding for treatment, staying to chat with Martha about the upcoming church social. Young Billy Morrison arrived for his weekly riding lesson, his confidence growing steadily under Tommy's patient instruction. Dr. Sarah Whitman, the new physician who'd joined their practice, conducted examinations with the same gentle thoroughness that characterized their approach to animal care. The naming of the new doctor had been purely coincidental, but Eli had found a strange comfort in hearing Sarah's name spoken daily in contexts of healing and hope rather than loss and grief. It felt like a blessing from his late wife, a sign that she approved of the new life he was building from the ashes of their shared dreams. At midday, when the sun reached its zenith and cast short shadows on the ground, Eli took a break from his work to spend time with Tempest. The stallion had become more than just a partner. He was a living symbol of the transformation that was possible when damaged souls chose healing over hatred, connection over isolation. "Remember when they called you the devil horse?" Eli asked softly, stroking the stallion's neck as they stood together in the peaceful paddock. "Hard to believe that was only 6 months ago." Tempest turned his great head and gently nuzzled Eli's shoulder, a gesture that had become their private language of affection and understanding. The horse remembered, just as Eli remembered, but those memories had lost their power to wound. They had become simply part of the story, the dark chapters that made the happy ending more meaningful. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, Visitors started arriving for the weekly demonstration that had become a tradition in Dustwater. People came from miles around to watch Eli and Tommy work with horses that others had written off as hopeless, to witness the transformation that patience and understanding could accomplish. Today's subject was a young stallion that had been brought in by a desperate rancher, a horse so traumatized by abuse that it hadn't allowed a human to touch it in over a year. The rancher had been ready to have it destroyed rather than risk it injuring someone. But Eli had convinced him to try a different approach. The crowd watched in respectful silence as Eli entered the pen where the frightened horse waited, his movements slow and non-threatening, his voice carrying the same gentle tone that had first reached Tempest months ago. There was no force, no domination, no attempt to impose human will on animal instinct. Instead, there was invitation, the offer of partnership to a creature that had forgotten such things were possible. It took nearly an hour, but eventually the stallion allowed Eli to approach, to touch, to begin the slow process of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by cruelty and ignorance. The crowd applauded when the horse finally accepted a halter, but Eli knew the real victory was smaller and more profound. It was the moment when fear gave way to hope in the animal's eyes. As the demonstration concluded and the visitors began to disperse, Tommy appeared at Eli's side with the kind of serious expression that meant important questions were coming. "Will you teach me to do that?" the boy asked. "Not just the riding, but the healing, the way you reach inside and find the hurt and help fix it." It was the question Eli had been expecting, the moment when his informal apprentice asked to become something more. Tommy had the gift that much was clear from his natural way with horses and his instinctive understanding of what they needed. With proper training and guidance, he could become the kind of horseman who changed lives rather than simply broke spirits. "It's not easy," Eli warned. "It takes years to learn, and you'll fail more often than you succeed at first. You'll see things that break your heart, and you'll wonder if you're strong enough to keep trying." Tommy nodded solemnly, his young face serious with determination. "But you'll teach me? All of it?" Eli looked around at the life he'd built in Dustwater, the center that brought healing to both human and animal, the community that had embraced him despite his broken past, the woman who'd helped him remember that love was possible even after devastating loss. Most importantly, he looked at the boy who represented the future, the next generation that would carry these lessons forward and make them stronger. "Yes," he said simply, "I'll teach you all of it." As the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Eli stood with Martha on the porch of the home they now shared, watching Tommy say goodnight to Tempest in the paddock below. The stallion lowered his great head to receive the boy's gentle pat, a gesture of trust that would have been impossible just months ago. It had all started with a false accusation and a cruel wager, with fear and hatred and the assumption that some things were too broken to be fixed. But it had become something beautiful, a testament to the power of understanding over force, patience over violence, love over fear. The devil horse was truly dead now, not killed by cruelty but transformed by compassion. In his place stood Tempest, partner and teacher, living proof that redemption was possible for even the most damaged souls. And in Dustwater, where justice had once been measured by the length of a rope, healing was now measured by the depth of connection between broken things, learning to be whole again. Sometimes, Eli thought as he watched the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, the most profound victories came not from conquering but from understanding, not from breaking but from mending, not from dominance but from the simple, revolutionary act of choosing love over fear. The devil horse had taught them that lesson, and Dustwater would never be the same.